Hiraethra Moonflare stood at the edge of the forest in the dead of night. The autumn rain came down in sheets, soaking through her dark cloak, plastering strands of ink-black hair flat against her cheeks. Her arms were wrapped around a bundle of ancient scrolls pressed tight to her chest, as though her arms were the last wall between those documents and the rest of the world. Her boots were soaked. Her hands were cold. Her face was perfectly still. Behind her, through the great arched windows of Darkbreaker Keep, firelight blazed gold against the stone. The drums of the great hunt feast thundered through the walls, so deep she could feel them in her sternum. She could hear Gorthan's laugh from here, warm and large and carrying, the laugh of a man who has never once doubted his own permanence. Nay, she stood at the edge of the tree line, and she listened to that laugh one last time. She turned away. What the 300 wolves celebrating in that blazing hall didn't know, what Gorthan Bloodflare himself had never fully understood, was that the blood treaties, binding 17 packs to the Bloodflare name, the territorial laws bearing his golden seal, the bond protocols that made him the most feared Alpha King in the known lands, Hiraethra had written every single one of them, from a sealed chamber carved into the lower stone of the keep, with a healing scar on her right palm and candle wax on her wrists, and no audience whatsoever. The credit had never been hers. The recognition had never come. And tonight, she had taken the one thing that proved it was all hers to begin with. If Gorthan woke in the morning believing he could dissolve her bond, silence her name, and continue his reign as though she had been nothing more than decoration, he was about to find out what happens when you build your empire on a mind you never bothered to thank. Some foundations, when they walk away, do not stay quiet. And some Lunas, once they have finished being overlooked, stop running from something and start running toward something the man who underestimated them could never be fast enough to follow. The hidden chamber had no name on any record in Darkbreaker Keep. It did not appear in the estate survey documents, and Hiraethra had read every one of those, because she had been the one to file them. It held no designation in the household maintenance ledger. If you walked the East Wing's lower corridor and counted the doors, or the numbers skipped from the storage room to the laundry passage without accounting for the space between them, the room existed in the way that certain essential things exist, completely and invisibly, and noticed by no one who was not looking. It was carved into the eastern lower stone of the keep, a room that looked out through a narrow window onto the forest rather than the road. It smelled of wolfsbane candles and old parchment and the faint sharpness of dried ink. A single desk filled most of the space, covered always in documents arranged in an order that made sense only to the person who arranged them. The candle nearest the window burned down fastest, because it was the one she worked beside when the light outside was gone, and her eyes needed something close. Hiraethra replaced it every 2 days, though she tried every time to remember to replace it every 3. She never managed 3. There was a small iron hook beside the door where she hung her cloak when she came in at night. There was a low wooden stool she had never used as a stool, only as an additional surface for documents that had run out of desk. There was one chair, solid and unadorned, worn smooth at the armrests by 5 years of long hours. The chair fit her exactly right. She had not bought it. She had found it in the estate storage and moved it here in the 2nd year of their bond, one night when Gorthan was hosting a war council dinner and the guest hall was loud until past midnight. No one had missed the chair. No one had noticed it was gone. That was the thing about invisible women. They could move furniture, and no one would know. Tonight she was working on the Iron Vale Accord. A territorial dispute had been building between the Northern Ridgepack and the Bloodflare borderlands for 2 seasons. The problem was not simple. It was layered, old, rooted in boundary agreements made 3 generations back, written in the ancient bond notation script that Gorthan's war elders could read only at the surface. The deeper encoding, the layer where the real terms lived, required an interpretive key. That key lived in Hiraethra's memory and nowhere else in the world. She dipped her quill. She wrote. In the second year of their bond, Gorthan had come to her late one winter evening with a stack of heritage documents thick enough to use as a doorstop. He had set them on her desk without ceremony, jaw tight, the golden eyes quiet with the particular expression of a proud man fighting his own desperation. The original blood seal system, the ancient bond notation that gave the blood flare line its authority over Allied territories, had survived for generations in a crumbling, barely legible form. His father had passed it to him as legend rather than working knowledge. And there was a spring council coming. He had said, "I need you to tell me what these say before the season turns." He had not said, "Please." He had not stayed to watch her work. He had trusted that the answers would appear, the way answers had always appeared for Gorthan Bloodflare, because the world had spent his entire life arranging itself conveniently around him. She had translated the crumbling heritage documents in 2 days. Then she had done something he had not asked for and could not have imagined. She rebuilt the entire notation system from the ground up, restructuring it into a living, layered document framework with an interpretive key so intricate it could not be read without the base cipher, a cipher she encoded once into her own memory and never wrote down. The blood seal system that the Alpha Council now considered the cornerstone of blood flare political authority, the one that bound 17 packs by sacred bond notation to Gorthan's line, was Hiraethra's creation, dressed in the clothes of ancient inheritance. That spring, Gorthan had presented the restored blood seal system to the Council, with the ease of a man receiving something that had always been his. He had accepted their reverence with a quiet nod, the steady gold of his eyes giving nothing away, his broad shoulders carrying the weight of their admiration without effort. Hiraethra had sat in the corridor outside the council chamber, listening through the old stone wall, her ink-stained hand curled around a cooling cup of tea. And she had felt, beneath the quiet of it, something that had not yet become grief. It had been something closer to patience. The deep, settled patience of a woman who had decided that love was enough, that being the one who made things work was enough, that existing in the knowledge of her own value was enough, even if no one else ever wrote it down. She had been wrong, of course, but that truth was still ahead of her, and in the second year, she still believed in him. She believed in him because of a night in the lower library. 2 months before their bonding ceremony. A winter storm had come out of the northern ridge in the dark, burying the keep grounds in 2 feet of snow by midnight, rattling the old iron shutters in their frames. Hiraethra had been working in the library because it was the only room with enough candles lit to read territorial maps by, and she had not slept in a day and a half, and somewhere between the 3rd and 4th map, she had simply stopped. She had woken to warmth she had not expected. Something set across her shoulders, heavy, soft, smelling of pine and iron. His cloak. She had blinked herself upright and found Gorthan sitting across the table from her in the low candlelight, one of her territorial maps spread in front of him, studying it with an expression that was nothing like the Alpha King the pack saw in daylight. He was just a man looking at something he did not understand, and finding it interesting rather than threatening. His elbows were on the table. His chin was in his hand. His gold eyes moved across the boundary lines with the quiet focus of someone genuinely puzzling something out. Not performing contemplation, just actually thinking. He had not heard her wake. She had a moment to watch him before he knew she was watching. This man who commanded every room he entered with such ease that the ease itself had become his reputation. Here, alone, with no one to be the Alpha King for. He was just curious. just interested. Just a person sitting with maps in a storm, while the woman he had chosen slept in the chair across from him, and staying there not because anyone was watching, but because he had chosen to stay, for he had looked up when she stirred. And what lived in his golden eyes in that moment was not performance. It was the quiet, uncalculated expression of someone who has found a rare thing and knows it. Someone who has been alone with the rare thing long enough to know it without needing to announce the finding. He had said, "You see things I miss." 4 words, spoken simply, without armor. She had not answered immediately. She had looked at him across the maps in the candlelight, in the library rattled by the storm, and she had felt something shift in her chest in the way of something that has been waiting a long time to find its place, and has finally, quietly, arrived. She had been with many things in her life that were fine and adequate, and did not ask much of her. This was not that. This was a man who had sat with her sleeping face in the candlelight, and looked at her maps instead of her, because he was genuinely interested, because he respected the work, because he saw something in it that he wanted to understand. "The eastern boundary here," she had said, and reached across the table to point, and he had leaned forward immediately, gold eyes moving to her finger. They had talked for 2 hours in the storm while the snow came down outside and the candles burned lower, and she had shown him 3 border anomalies that had been generating low-grade territorial tension for a decade, and he had listened with the complete attention of a man who genuinely understood that the person across from him was smarter than him in this specific room and was not threatened by it. And that was the moment Hiraethra Moonflare fell, not into poetry, not into a dream, but into the full and unguarded love of a woman who has, for the first time, found the one person who makes her feel like her mind is a gift rather than a burden. She had loved him from that night with everything she had. She had given without condition. She had built without credit. She had stayed without applause. She had believed in the man who looked at her maps and saw something worth seeing. The man who had sat in a storm and learned from her and not pretended otherwise. The man who, 2 months later, had pressed his palm to hers in the bonding ritual, and the scar had formed between them, and she had felt the bond click into place like something she had been missing her whole life returning to her. She had been so sure. She had built 5 years on that sureness, and she had been so completely, entirely sure. That man was at the head of the table now, and he was not looking at her maps tonight. The Grand Hall feast stretched the length of Darkbreaker Keep's oldest room. 3 long tables carved from obsidian dark timber, candlelight in iron branches overhead, the fire in the great hearth big enough to walk into. Wolves filled every seat in their finest, furs and silver and clan-woven cloth, the deep hum of 300 conversations layered beneath the string players in the gallery above. Hiraethra sat at the far end of the Alpha's table. She was in forest green, a deep, quiet colour that she had always preferred. The goblet in her hand was silver and cold. The scar on her right palm, where the bonding ritual had pressed her blood and Gorthon's together in the sacred mark 5 years ago, was pale against the silver stem if anyone looked. No one looked. Gorthon was at the head of the table, broad-shouldered and golden-eyed, his laugh filling the hall the way it always did, easy and big, the laugh of a man who has never once doubted that a room belongs to him. Feralis Shadowbreaker sat at his right hand. She was the lead diplomatic envoy of the Eastern Ridge Pacts, here for a week of territorial discussions that Hiraethra had arranged in every practical detail. The menus, the chamber assignments, the security rotation, the formal gift exchange timing. All of it ran on rails Hiraethra had laid down before the delegation arrived. Feralis had silver hair worn loose and warm, and she moved through a room the way smoke moves, settling into every available space without appearing to try. She was wearing blood red. She laughed at something Gorthon said and touched his arm lightly, briefly, the touch of a woman who does not yet own the thing but is certain she will. Hiraethra watched the candle flame at the center of the table. It bent in a draught she could not find the source of. She set her goblet down. She picked it up again. She had learned, across 5 years, that visible reactions were expensive things. The ones she could not afford to show, she stored in the hidden chamber, where she stored everything that mattered. At the morning council meeting the following day, the one she did not attend, because invitations to such meetings had quietly stopped coming, Gorthon presented her completed Iron Veil Accord analysis as his own overnight reading of the situation. She had left it under the War Council chamber door before sunrise, her handwriting hidden under the formal notation, her conclusion tucked beneath a seal no one questioned. Branthor Nightbreaker, head war elder, and the most respected wolf in the council room, nodded with the gravity of a man in the presence of generational intelligence. He said, "Alpha, your understanding of the northern boundary architecture is extraordinary. Your father's legacy lives in you." Gorthon accepted this with a measured nod. He did not correct it. At the far end of the table, Kael'thor Grimbreaker said nothing. He only looked at the document in front of him for a moment longer than he needed to. He had begun to notice, very quietly, very carefully, that the sharpest intelligence always appeared on mornings when the Alpha seemed to haven't slept, as though someone else had been awake through the night, working through the problem. He had not yet spoken the observation aloud, but it was forming into a question, slowly, the way ice forms over still water. Hiraethra returned to the hidden chamber after leaving the dispatch. She stood at the east-facing window for a moment. The morning was pale. Somewhere above her, she could hear the familiar heavy rhythm of Gorthon's footsteps moving through his chambers, a sound she had memorized without meaning to. She thought about the library. She thought about the storm. She thought about the man who had put his cloak on her shoulders and looked at her maps like they were worth looking at. She pressed her ink-stained hand flat against the cold stone window ledge. She gave herself one breath of grief, precise and private, like everything else she allowed herself. Then she turned back to her desk and picked up her quill. There was always more work to do. The Eastern Ridge delegation stayed 7 days. For 7 days, Darkbreaker, keep filled with noise and color and the carefully managed performance of diplomatic warmth. The visiting wolves were housed in the East guest quarters that Hiraethra had prepared. The kitchen ran on menus she had designed. The security rotation in the outer courtyard, adjusted to accommodate the delegation's overnight schedule, was a plan she had submitted through the household management chain 2 weeks before the delegation arrived. She ran it all from the background, efficiently and without announcement, the way she ran everything. On the third evening feast, Feralis leaned toward Merilith Silverflare, elder council member, and said something in a lowered voice that was not quite low enough. Green is a forest creature's color, or a healer's. Not quite the Lunar Queen's table. She said it with a small, light laugh, her silver hair catching the candlelight as she tilted her head, just slightly, toward Hiraethra's end of the table. Myrelith responded with the smooth, unreadable smile of a woman who has not yet decided which way the political wind is blowing. Gorthon, at the head of the table, heard it. The corner of his mouth lifted. Barely. Almost nothing. But Hiraethra saw it. She had trained herself for 5 years to see it. That small, involuntary register of a man who finds someone else's cleverness entertaining when it comes at a cost. He does not have to pay. The corner of his mouth lifted, and then he turned back to Feralis and said something that made her laugh, and the conversation moved on the way conversations at powerful tables always move on, casually, indifferently, as though nothing had just been used and discarded. Hiraethra set her goblet down. She looked at the candle flame. She counted. That night, Elinthra Frostflare, Hyrethra's personal maid, and the only person in the keep who knew the hidden chamber existed, helped her out of the forest green dress. Elynthra was young, barely past her first decade of adult years, with the kind of attentiveness that never became nosiness, and the kind of loyalty that did not announce itself. She said nothing about the feast. She said nothing about Firelis, or the comment, or the corner of Gorthon's mouth. She simply braided Hyrethra's hair for sleep, and said, quietly, to her reflection in the bronze mirror, "You know more about what keeps this keep standing than anyone who sat at that table tonight." Hyrethra looked at herself in the bronze mirror. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is the problem, isn't it?" She did not phrase it as a question. Elynthra did not answer it as one. She finished the braid and pressed her palm briefly against Hyrethra's shoulder. And that was enough. 2 days after the delegation's successful territorial agreement, a document Hyrethra had drafted in its entirety across 3 sleepless nights, restructuring the boundary provisions in the Northern Ridge's favor, just enough to ensure their future cooperation, without ceding Bloodflare strategic ground. Gorthon stood before the full Alpha Council. He spoke with great confidence about instinct, about inheritance, about his father's legacy flowing through his decisions like blood through stone. He touched the Alpha seal at his chest, gold catching the light, a gesture that communicated ownership without effort. He received the Council's commendation for the Accord's precision and depth. Branthorn Nightbreaker said it was the finest territorial work the Bloodflare line had produced in a generation. Gorthon smiled. He believed this. The Council believed it. The Pack believed it. And not a single person in that chamber thought to ask what had happened between the night the dispatch arrived and the morning the analysis appeared, or who might have been awake during the hours in between. Hyrethra was not in the chamber. She had not been invited. Late that night, alone in the hidden chamber, she held her right hand up toward the candle flame. The bonding scar on her palm, the mark made when her blood and Gorthon's had pressed together in the mating ceremony 5 years ago, caught the light. In wolf tradition, the scar was supposed to glow faintly when the bond between mates was living and strong. It had glowed for the first year. She had watched it dim slowly through the second. By the 3rd year, she had stopped checking. Now it was only a scar, pale and quiet and permanent. She closed her hand. She picked up her quill. She went back to work. The morning the delegation departed, Firelis stopped Hyrethra in the corridor outside the great hall. She was all warmth and composed grace, thanking her for the beautiful rooms, for the exceptional meals, for the care visible in every detail of their stay. She said it the way such things are said, when the compliment is a tool rather than a gift, arranged to establish a hierarchy, to make clear who belongs to the decor and who belongs to the conversation. "Or the keep is truly exceptional," Firelis said. "One can see how much care has gone into every corner of it." Hyrethra looked at her for a long, still moment. Then she said, "The keep appreciates your notice. Not I. Not we. The keep." It was a small, precise thing. It landed exactly where she intended. Firelis blinked once, brief, controlled, and then her warmth returned like a mask resettled. But the sting had reached her, and they both knew it. Hyrethra turned and walked back down the corridor. It was the first time in 2 years she had allowed herself the edge she kept hidden. And she told herself it was the last, because a woman who reveals her edge too early also reveals that she still cares. And she had decided, standing in that corridor, that caring visibly was something she could no longer afford. 3 weeks after the delegation left, the keep had settled back into its regular rhythms, the morning council dispatches, the afternoon training in the outer yard, the long quiet evenings where the grand hall carried only a low fire and a handful of wolves, too dedicated to their drink to retire early. Hiraethra had returned fully to the hidden chamber and its work. The Ironvale Accord had been ratified. A new boundary survey request had arrived from the Western Marshland Pax. She was halfway through the analysis. She was carrying a tray. Gorthan's preferred fire herb tea, brewed at the particular strength he had always taken it. 4 dried leaves, boiled for exactly the count of 40, poured over a single piece of dried winter root. She had made it without thinking about why she was making it, which was itself a kind of answer. But there was a version of caring that had outlived the emotion driving it, and that version was called habit, and Hiraethra had not yet decided whether to mourn it or simply set it down. She moved through the corridor toward the War Council chamber. She had intended to knock, enter, set the tray down, and leave in under a minute. She had not intended to stop at the door. She stopped at the door. Not because she was listening, because she heard, through the heavy old oak, Feraelis's voice, and the warmth in it was constructed rather than felt, the way a house is constructed rather than grown. She stood still. The tray grew heavy in her hands. The bond dissolution Hiraethra had expected. She had built herself, slowly, over the past several months, into the shape of a woman who has already accounted for what is coming. That the dissolution of their mating bond had stopped being a surprise, and started being a countdown. What she had not accounted for was the second part. Feraelis's voice, through the door, and after the dissolution is formalized, the Void Speaker declaration before the Council. Jorvik's Moonbreaker has already been approached. A Void Speaker. The oldest designation in Pack law, reserved for mated wolves whose bond had been formally dissolved under accusation of instability or dishonor. A Void Speaker's testimony carried no council weight. Her words were heard. They were not recorded. They were present and entirely without power. If Hiraethra was declared Void Speaker before she could speak, before she could tell anyone about the hidden chamber, the 5 years of work, at the blood seal system she had built, and the treaties she had written, and the name that should have been on every document she had ever set under a door, it would all dissolve in the air before it reached any elder's ear. The word of a Void Speaker against the word of an Alpha King was not a contest. It was a silence shaped like a contest. She heard Gorthan's voice then, measured, matter of fact. Not angry, which was somehow the worst part. There is a wellness retreat, 2 territories north. Very comfortable, very permanent. A Void Speaker in residence there is a Void Speaker whose voice reaches no one. Feraelis asked whether Hiraethra might cause difficulty before the declaration could be filed. A pause. A very short one. Then Gorthan said, "She never has before." The tray was very heavy. Hiraethra turned. She carried the tray to the nearest window ledge, set it down with complete composure, and stood at the window for one long moment, looking out at the training yard below, the stone wall, the eastern gate in the distance, the autumn trees beyond it shifting in the cold wind. She felt something she had not expected to feel in this moment. She had prepared herself for grief. She had prepared herself for rage. Both were present. She could feel them, like 2 low fires in a room she was not standing in. But they were not the loudest thing. The loudest thing was clarity. The specific, absolute clarity that arrives when every remaining door has been closed from outside. When the only thing left is the door you build yourself. She walked to the hidden chamber. She sat at her desk. She opened a fresh sheet of parchment. And she began to plan, with the same focused precision she had always applied to bond notation and territorial law, for herself. She had never once, in 5 years, made a planning error. That evening, she called Elinthra to the hidden chamber for the first time. She did not tell her everything. She told her enough. She asked 3 questions, calmly, that seemed small and separate. The Eastern Gate Guard rotation schedule. The delivery window for the scroll merchant Eric's Darkbreaker, who made his supply run to the keep on the 3rd day of each week. Whether anyone in the household could see the east-facing window of the hidden chamber from the garden path below. Elynthra answered each one. Then she sat quietly for a moment and said, "How long do we have?" Hiraethra looked at her. 16 days. Possibly less. Elynthra did not flinch. She did not cry. She did not ask the many reasonable questions she was certainly holding. She simply reached across the desk and moved the cold cup of tea closer to Hiraethra's hand. Hiraethra picked it up and drank it. "I'm coming with you," Elynthra said. "You are not." Hiraethra's voice was gentle and final. "If you come with me, they will know immediately that you knew. You stay. You say you saw nothing unusual. And when the time comes, when it is safe, I will send for you. I promise." Elynthra looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded. Alone that night, Hiraethra unrolled the blood seal scrolls from their vault. She had taken a copy of the vault seal configuration from the estate maintenance records 2 years ago, and recopied it, quietly, without event, and spread the authentic documents across her desk. She traced the notation with her fingertips, the patterns only her mind could navigate, the layered encoding she had built into the system during that brutal winter when Gorthon had dropped a stack of crumbling documents on her desk and asked her to save his authority before spring. She thought about the library. She thought about the storm. She thought about 4 words. "You see things I miss," and what it meant that the man who said them had just discussed the erasure of her voice with the same calm he used to plan battle strategy. She rolled the scrolls back up. She tied them. She sat in the dark for exactly 1 minute. Then she lit the candle again and went back to work. In 6 weeks, she would need a decoy, a perfect one. She already knew exactly how to build it. The Great Hunt Feast was the Blood Flare Pack's most ancient tradition. Every year, on the first deep, cold night of autumn, the entire pack gathered in the Grand Hall, 300 wolves in their finest, drums in the old carved pattern, the great hearth blazing from sundown to sunrise, the kind of fire that could be seen for miles through the forest dark. It was the loudest night in the keep's calendar, and it was the night Hiraethra had chosen from the very beginning, because no one looks for what is leaving when everyone is celebrating what remains. She appeared at the start of the evening in Forest Green, as she always did. She exchanged polite words with Branthor Nightbreaker's mate, a kind and uncomplicated woman who always asked about Hiraethra's health and seemed to genuinely mean it. Hiraethra answered warmly. She ate 3 bites of the roasted game at the start of the first course. She waited. Though 20 minutes in, she pressed her fingertips to her temple, a small, visible gesture, and excused herself from the table. "A low fever," she said. The words came easily. She had said them in slight variations, dozens of times over 5 years, and no one had ever, not once, thought to question them. Hiraethra's quiet absences from long social evenings were one of the most reliable features of life at Darkbreaker Keep. She was simply that kind of Luna. Delicate, private, easily overwhelmed by noise. Or so the story went. She went upstairs. She did not go to her chambers. The Blood Seal Vault was on the 2nd level of the East Wing, at the end of a corridor that Gorthon had designated off-limits to household staff after dark since the first year of his reign. His own rule, never questioned. Though Hiraethra had always privately noted that men with nothing to hide do not make rules about which corridors may be used and when. She did not light a lamp. She had not needed one for this corridor in 2 years. She moved through the dark by memory. Each flagstone, each irregularity in the floor, the exact weight of her step required to prevent the loose board near the third wall sconce from announcing her. Her breathing was slow. Her hands were steady. The drums below were deep enough to feel through the stone. The vault seal was a 7-point bond notation mechanism. Its access code was derived from the Blood Seal Protocol, the system Hyrithra had rebuilt in year 2 of their bond. Gorthon used the surface code, the one she had shown him, simple and functional, the outer layer of the mechanism's architecture. He did not know there was a deeper layer. She had never mentioned it. The deeper code was the one she had built for herself, because a woman who rebuilds the lock knows to keep a key no one else can copy. The vault opened without a sound. She reached inside. Her fingers found the authentic Blood Seal scrolls. The real ones, worn at the edges from years of handling, heavy with the weight of everything they contained and everything they proved. She lifted them out. She set the decoy scrolls in their place. 6 weeks of work, sourced in 3 untraceable transactions through Eric's Darkbreaker's careful network of contacts, aged parchment from 3 separate suppliers, none of whom had spoken to the others. Notation columns filled with elegant, meaningless symbols in ink she had aged herself over a low flame. Every physical detail precisely matched. On the first inner page of the lead decoy scroll, what in handwriting she had taken careful pains to make slightly different from her own. I'm free. She closed the vault. She replaced the seal. She stood in the dark corridor with the authentic Blood Seal pressed against her chest. 3 floors below, the feast drums were at their height, the long roll that marked the peak of the evening, the moment when every wolf in the hall was fully given over to the celebration. She turned and walked. The servants' passage at the rear of the keep opened onto the stone courtyard connecting to the kitchen garden. Beyond the garden wall, the eastern tree line. The estate perimeter was a high stone wall broken by 3 iron gates, 2 staffed at all hours. The third, the eastern auxiliary gate, which opened onto a forest path leading to the old pack road 2 miles north, had not been attended by a permanent guard in 3 years, since Hyrithra herself had submitted the revised security assessment, recommending reallocation of guard positions to the front approach. She had submitted that assessment 14 months ago. She had chosen this night 14 months ago, when she realized the eastern gate would be her door. She moved through the courtyard in the dark, along the inner wall, placing each step on wet autumn grass rather than gravel. The rain had begun again, steady and cold, quieting everything under its sound. She reached the eastern gate's mechanism panel, lifted it. Her fingers moved across the notation positions in the dark, reading each contact point the way she read parchment, by touch, by memory, as by the pattern she had encoded into her own hands through repetition. The release configuration had been recalibrated 6 weeks ago, during what the household records showed as a routine structural inspection. She had done it herself, at midday, alone, in under 4 minutes. The gate opened. 1 inch. 2. Enough. A guard's voice, somewhere to her left, sheltering from the rain under the stone overhang near the outer wall, trading low words with a companion about the feast inside, the warmth of it, the mead, Gorthon's speech. The voice drifted. The other laughed. Neither moved. Hyrithra went still against the wall with one flat palm against the cold iron, holding the gate from swinging wider. She waited. The rain came down around her. The guards talked. She breathed, slow and even, and she waited. No, and then the voices shifted, and one of them said something about getting another log for the overhang fire, and in the moment of shuffling, she stepped through and pulled the gate precisely back to its resting position. On the other side, the forest, black and loud with rain. She did not light her oil lamp. She moved by the mental map she had built from estate survey correspondence, documents she had processed and filed for 5 years without Gorthon ever asking what they contained. 2 miles north, a hired carriage at the mile marker at midnight, arranged through a chain of 3 intermediaries who did not know each other's names, coordinated through Eric's Darkbreaker's careful ears and long memory. She walked. The scrolls were wrapped in oilcloth against the rain. She held them close. Behind her, through the trees, the keep's firelight was still visible, a warm amber blur against the dark, burning and indifferent, entirely unaware that the thing holding it up was walking away through the trees. She did not look back at it. Not because it wasn't difficult, but because she had already looked at it from every angle, in every light, for 5 years. She knew exactly what it was. She knew exactly what it was not. She turned her face to the road and kept walking, and the rain came down around her, steady and patient, and it did not matter. She reached the mile marker at 7 minutes to midnight. The carriage was already there. The driver, a quiet, older wolf named simply Cale, with the incurious eyes of a man who had learned that not knowing things kept him comfortable, had been paid well enough to understand that no questions was the only arrangement on offer. He did not speak. He opened the carriage door. Hiraethra climbed in. She sat back against the worn seat. She placed the blood seal scrolls in her lap and rested her hands on them. Outside, the rain continued, steady and patient, and entirely on her side. The carriage began to move. She closed her eyes. She breathed in. One long, slow breath, the first unhurried breath she had taken in 16 days. In the space behind her, closed eyes, in the dark, behind the dark, she held very still. And for the first time in 5 years, the silence she existed inside was entirely her own. No footsteps overhead. No distant laugh carrying through stone walls. No empty mornings and invisible dispatches and borrowed credit signed in someone else's name. Just the rain, and the road, and the scrolls in her lap, and Hiraethra Moonflare going somewhere she had chosen, toward something she had built, at last. She did not cry. She hadn't cried in 16 days, and she did not cry now. What she allowed herself, in the rocking dark of the carriage, was something quieter and more complete than tears. She allowed herself to simply exist, unheld, unobserved, unperformed, for the first time she could remember. The carriage moved north, the rain moved with it, and Darkbreaker Keep grew smaller in the dark behind her, until there was nothing left of it at all. The Gorthon Bloodflare woke the morning after the great hunt feast, with the particular heaviness of a man who has eaten well, and drunk deeply, and laughed longer than he has in months. He lay in the wide bed of the Alpha's chambers, gold eyes moving to the high window where the morning light was coming in, pale and still, and he lay there for a moment in the easy, thoughtless comfort of a man whose world is arranged conveniently around him. He dressed without urgency. He made his way down to the War Council chamber, expecting what he always found on mornings after difficult evenings: the translated dispatch, the written analysis, the recommendations clear and ready, in the small, precise handwriting that appeared without explanation every time one was needed. The desk was empty. He stood in the room's silence, processing the absence the way you process a step that isn't there in the dark, a lurch before the understanding of what has happened. Then he catalogued it under manageable and sent for Ilinthra. Ilinthra arrived with the composure of someone who had spent a night practicing how to stand very still. She told him the Luna's chambers had been found unoccupied at dawn, that several items of clothing were gone, that the silver-threaded hair comb, the one from Hiraethra's mother, given to her on the morning of their bonding ceremony, was not on the dressing table. Gorthon stood in the corridor outside the council chamber and absorbed this information for exactly 4 seconds. Then he turned and walked to the east wing at pace, because the scrolls were the thing that mattered. Not Hiraethra. The scrolls. Did the political architecture lived in those scrolls? And if she had touched those scrolls? He entered his surface code at the vault. The lock released. He opened the vault. The scrolls were there. He exhaled. He picked up the top one, unrolled it, looked at the notation columns, immaculate and complex and entirely as they should be, and told himself the weight was right, and the parchment was right, and everything was fine. He rolled it back up. He went to the morning council session with his full authority deployed, and presented a strategic summary of the Northern Ridge situation that was confident and vague in equal measure, because the decoded analysis was not on his desk, and he had never once, in 5 years, had to decode a dispatch himself. He managed it. He always managed things in public. It's because that had been the arrangement for as long as he could remember. The difficult work resolved before he needed it, and him present to sign the result. Kelthor Grimbreaker watched him from across the table. He watched the way the Alpha's confident summary landed a little wide of what the dispatch actually contained. A vagueness, a near miss, the kind of gap visible only to someone who had been quietly paying attention. Kelthor folded his hands on the table and looked at nothing in particular and said not a word. But the question that had been forming in him for months had just crystallized into something with weight. 4 days after the feast, a formal territorial boundary dispute from the Northern Ridge required cross-referencing the vault scrolls against the boundary survey records. Gorthon took the scrolls to his study. They spread them across the desk and began the cross-reference. Something did not align. He checked again. He pulled a second scroll. He checked that one. The measurements were wrong. Not wrong in the way of a small error. Wrong in the way of a language he didn't speak being rendered in handwriting that looked right. He opened the innermost scroll last. He turned to the first page. 2 words. Handwriting, almost, but not quite Heraethra's. I'm free. He was in the corridor before he finished exhaling. The sound that left him was not a roar. It was something smaller and more honest than that. The sound of a man whose entire architecture has revealed its foundation all at once, and the foundation is not what he was told it was. He put his fist through the stone wall. He stood in the corridor of his grand keep with his knuckles bleeding, a chest heaving, staring at the hole he had made. And for the first time in his adult life, he did not know what to do next. Not tactically, not politically, not in any direction at all. He stood there for a long time. Fyralis came to the keep the following morning. She arrived with a plausible explanation and a composed, warm expression, and the practical intelligence of a woman who understands how to manage what is visible. She sat across from Gorthon at the council table, from which everyone else had quietly removed themselves, and she offered narratives. A formal pack announcement about the Luna's health, a suggestion of a northern retreat, framed as a period of rest rather than a departure. She was skilled at this, genuinely skilled, at identifying the story that could be told to preserve the surface of things, or what she was not skilled at was the thing underneath the surface, the functioning infrastructure of a pack's political authority, the encoded language that bound 17 territories in sacred obligation. She had understood that the power was in Gorthon. She had never had reason to understand where the power in Gorthon actually came from. He looked at her across the table with an expression she had not seen before. He asked quietly, "Can you read bond notation?" She said carefully that she had some familiarity with the eastern ridges, and used a term that was wrong. Not slightly wrong, categorically wrong. The kind of wrong that told him immediately that the woman across from him had been leaning on the appearance of shared authority rather than its substance, and the substance had just walked out through the eastern gate into the rain. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned back to the empty space on the desk where the decoded dispatches used to appear. The silence in that room was its own kind of answer. Firelis left that afternoon. She took her things with the efficient composure of a woman who understands that associations are valued by what they offer, and this one had run out. She left one earring, a red glass drop, on the dressing room ledge. Gorthon found it that evening and put it in a drawer and did not look at it again. 3 weeks later, the riders returned. Their report was brief. The trail had led to the Silver Reach territory. There it stopped. Not went cold, but stopped in the specific way that a trail stops when the person at the end of it has stopped being available to be followed. The woman they were looking for had formal standing under the Silver Reach Alliance as a Blood Seal scholar, protected by the sovereign authority of Orlithia Warbreaker, and this was the part that sat heaviest, shielded by the border accords Gorthon had ratified 4 years ago, accords Hiraethra had written, every provision of which she had, apparently, known by memory. Gorthon read the report at his study window. The autumn leaves were letting go of the trees outside, in the quiet, patient way that things let go when their season is finished. He stood very still. He thought about the scar on her palm. He thought about the way she sat at the end of the feast table, watching the candle flames with her goblet in her hand, never reacting, never performing, just watching. He thought about the library during the storm, the cloak on her shoulders, 4 words he had meant completely, and then somehow, over 5 years, failed to act on in any way that mattered. You see things I miss. The grand hall that evening was quiet. The fire was down to coals, the drums were silent. Gorthon Bloodflare sat alone in the Alpha's chair at the head of the long obsidian table, and the hall stretched empty around him in both directions, and there was no performance required, and no audience waiting, and nothing left to inherit. Now there was only the truth of a room that had always been louder than the mind that ran it, and now both were still. The Silver Reach Pack territory began where the Bloodflare borderlands ended, separated by a ridge of silver birch hills that in autumn were nothing short of breathtaking. Pale trunks, gold leaves, and a quality of light that fell differently there, softer and more honest, as though the land itself had something to say, and had found the right way to say it. Hiraethra arrived on the 4th day. She had changed carriages twice, and rested one night at a small wayhouse under a name that was not her own. She was tired in the deep way of someone who has been running on precision for weeks, and has not yet given the body permission to feel it. Her forest green dress was creased and damp at the hem. Her hair had come loose from its pins into something closer to soft. She was still wearing her ink-stained fingers and her round reading lenses. She was carrying the authentic Blood Seal scrolls under one arm as though they belonged to her. Because they did. The Reach Hall was not the largest stronghold she had ever seen. It was built for intelligence rather than spectacle. Stone and good timber, libraries that occupied more floor space than the feasting hall, a quality of organized calm in every corridor. Hiraethra walked through it and felt, for the first time in years, as though she were in a place built by people who understood what things were actually for. Orlithia Warbreaker received her in a personal study. She was a woman in her mid-40s, powerfully built, with the particular stillness of someone who has long since stopped needing to prove anything. She wore no ceremony. She took up space the way certain mountains do. Not through aggression, but through an absolute absence of apology for existing. She looked at Hiraethra for a long, unhurried moment, the way a woman looks at another woman when she is deciding something serious. And then she said, "The Luna of the Bloodflare Pack is either the most valuable mind to walk through my door in 20 years, or a very elaborate problem. One question will tell me which." She asked a technical question about the Blood Seal notation system, deeply specific, targeted at the mathematical architecture of the layered encoding, the kind of question that cannot be answered by someone who has merely read about the system. It can only be answered by someone who built it. Hiraethra answered it on a sheet of paper in 4 minutes. She demonstrated the method. She identified 3 structural vulnerabilities in the original ancient design and showed the corrections she had built into her rebuilt version. She wrote in the precise, efficient shorthand of someone for whom the work is not performance, but instinct. Orlithia read it in silence. She was quiet for a long time after. Then the corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one, the expression of a woman who has found exactly what she came looking for without letting herself appear surprised. She said, "The blood flare name has always struck me as an operation whose authority rests on a foundation it cannot describe," Hiraethra said, with perfect composure. "I am in a position to confirm that. The arrangement they reached required no elaborate ceremony. Hiraethra would serve as blood seal arbiter and intelligence counsel to the Silver Reach Alliance, a role with full standing, full voice, and full legal protection under the border accords that Gorthon had ratified and Hiraethra had written. In exchange, the Silver Reach gained access to the only complete and authentic blood seal system in the known territories, the system that 17 Pax currently operated under, in good faith, under the assumption that its authority resided in the blood flare line. The understanding of where that authority actually resided was about to become a matter of considerable political consequence. She was given rooms in the east wing of the Reach Hall. They were not grand, or they had a good window, this one facing the silver birch ridge, which was better than a garden wall, and a solid desk and candles in generous supply. Within a week, the desk was covered in parchment. The inkwell was in constant use. Hiraethra Moonflare, the lunar queen who had been compared to a forest creature by a woman in a red dress at a feast table, was building something that belonged entirely to herself. She ordered a new pair of reading lenses. She left the green dresses folded at the bottom of her travelling case. She began, without announcement, to wear silver. The work was different now, not in its nature, because the work was always the nature of it, the careful, precise, necessary building of systems that held things together, but in its meaning. Every document she signed carried her name. Every analysis she submitted was credited to its author. Orlithia introduced her to the council as our arbiter, and looked at no one in particular when she said it, as though the designation were simply a fact and not a restoration. It was a restoration. Hiraethra knew it. She did not perform gratitude for it. She simply worked, and let the work be its own announcement. One evening, 3 weeks into her time at the Silver Reach, she sat at her desk with a blank sheet of parchment in front of her, and she thought about Gorthon. Not the Alpha King, not the performance, not the golden-eyed man with the laugh that filled rooms and the broad shoulders and the ease of someone who has never had to ask for the space he takes up. She thought about the man in the library, the one who had sat in the candlelight during a winter storm and set his cloak on the shoulders of a woman who had fallen asleep over territorial maps, and looked at those maps with genuine curiosity, and said 4 words that were completely true. She thought about the first year of their bond, the mornings he had come to her hidden chamber door, not often but sometimes, and knocked and waited for her to answer instead of simply opening it, because he understood, at least then, that the space was hers. She thought about the way he had once read one of her completed accords all the way through, slowly, at the desk beside her, asking questions every few pages that were not the questions of a man performing interest, but the questions of a man who was genuinely working to understand. She thought about how, afterward, he had set the document down and looked at her for a long moment and said nothing, because some appreciation sits below language, and he had, at least once, known the difference. She thought about whether that man still lived somewhere inside the one who had discussed the Void Speaker declaration in the war room while she stood outside the door with a tray going cold. Whether love, once real, retains something real inside the person who has chosen to spend it carelessly, like a coal still warm beneath ash. Something that could be blown back into flame if someone chose to, if they chose to, if they ever once chose to stop performing and start looking. She had spent years waiting for him to choose to. She picked up her quill. She held it over the blank sheet. She set it down. She did not write the letter. Not because she had nothing to say. She had years of things to say. She had 5 years of invisible dispatches and cold tea and candles burning down, and the specific loneliness of lying beside someone who has stopped looking at you, of being in the same room and being entirely alone in it, of giving your best work and your best self, and your quiet, steady love into a silence that signed its name to all of it, and moved on. She had years of things to say, and she had the words for every one of them. And she did not write the letter. Because the letter she would write was for the man she had believed he was becoming. And she had already grieved that man, thoroughly, alone, by candlelight, in the room he never visited. She was done grieving things that had not fully existed. She was done spending herself on a love that had never learned to account for itself. She was done being the foundation that no one walked down to look at. The building above the foundation had a name on it. The foundation was finished being nameless. She picked up her quill. She turned to the work that was waiting. She wrote something else entirely. A new territorial framework for the Alliance's western border. Her own name at the top of the page, her own signature at the bottom. The blank sheet sat to one side. She did not look at it again. In the morning, Elinthra would use it for a shopping list, and neither of them would comment on the symmetry. A message came from Branthor Nightbreaker, delivered not through official council channels, but through the private courier route Hyrethra had established herself during the border negotiations 2 years prior. Branthor was writing without the Alpha's knowledge and without his sanction. The message was short and honest, the way Branthor had always been honest when there was no audience to perform for. He said the council was asking questions that could not be answered without her. He said the pack was not failing, but it was not what it had been. He said, "I do not think it was ever what we believed it was. I think we were well managed, and we did not look closely enough at who was doing the managing." He did not ask her to return. He knew her well enough to know that was a door that had closed. He only said, "When the time is right, or the door you choose to walk through should be your own." Hyrethra folded the letter. She put it in her desk drawer. She sat for a long moment looking out at the silver birch ridge in the evening light, pale trunks, the last of the autumn gold letting go, the clean cold air coming through the window. She kept cracked because she had always worked better with cold air, and there was no one here to tell her otherwise. She said quietly, to no one, with something in her voice that was not quite a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood. "It will be." 6 months after the great hunt feast, the Silver Birch Hills at the border between Silverreach and Bloodflare territory were deep in the last of autumn, gold thinning to bare silver, the meadow between the 2 territory walls flat and cold and still. A formal encampment had appeared there, Silverreach standards, a diplomatic tent, a line of formally armed wolves at a respectful distance. The encampment had not arrived unannounced. 3 days prior, a letter had reached Darkbreaker Keep, delivered by a Silverreach rider to Branthor Nightbreaker at the outer gate. The letter was written in blood seal notation. The full system. The real one. Gorthon sat in his study, holding it for a long time. He recognized the notation marks. He had seen them his entire life, in documents that built his authority and shaped his territory and bore his seal. He had never been able to read them without the analysis that appeared, without explanation, under his council chamber door every morning. He turned the letter over in his hands. Not a word of it reached him, and he sent for every notation reader available at the keep. 2 council scribes, an elder with a reputation for archival knowledge. None of them could crack the base interpretive layer, the layer Hiraethra had never documented outside her own memory. They could read the surface characters. The encoded meaning underneath was simply not there for them. The letter was a message before it was a document. She was telling him, with precision and courtesy and total authority, that she would be at the border meadow in 3 days for a formal territorial negotiation. And she was telling him in the only language that mattered between them, the one only she could speak. Gorthon dressed on the morning of the negotiation with deliberate care. Full alpha regalia, his medals in their formal order, his jaw set, his gold eyes steady, as he was very good at the preparation, always had been. The carriage to the meadow gave him 30 minutes, and he used them the way he had always used difficult preparation time, assembling the performance, settling the authority into his posture, becoming again the man the room expected. He sat down at the negotiation table inside the tent. He arranged his papers. He waited. He heard her footsteps before the tent flap opened, recognizing the rhythm before his mind caught up, because 5 years of stone corridors had made her step as familiar as the sound of the keep's own walls. Then the flap opened, and Hiraethra walked in. She was wearing deep silver, not the silver of inherited regalia, a different silver, the particular shade of something chosen deliberately, built from intention rather than tradition. Her hair was arranged with quiet formality at the back of her neck. Her posture carried the authority of a woman who has somewhere to be and every right to be there. She was not wearing her round reading lenses. She carried a leather document case. She moved through the tent with the steady purpose of someone who has already accounted for every variable in the room, including the one sitting across the table from her. She sat. She looked at him, directly, clear-eyed, composed, for exactly as long as it took to establish that this cost her nothing. Then she opened the document case and placed the authentic blood seal scrolls on the table between them. The tent was very quiet. Gorthon looked at the scrolls. He looked at Hiraethra. Something crossed his face that was too complicated for a single name. Recognition and shame, and the beginning of an understanding that had no comfortable place to land. He looked at her, and the calculation he had spent 6 months building, the one where her return was a political necessity he could frame as reconciliation, sat in his chest like something he didn't entirely believe in, even now. He spoke first, her name, quietly, the way he had said it in the library during the storm, or in the voice underneath the Alpha King's register. Hiraethra. A pause. Then, come home. The pack needs you. A longer pause. I understand now what I didn't before. What I took. What I failed to. I know. Come back and it will be different. He meant it. She could see that he meant it, in the way people mean things when the alternative is unacceptable, and the loss has finally clarified into something that cannot be reframed. He was looking at her with something genuine. She recognized it, had loved it once, had built entire years around it. She also recognized, with the specific clarity of a woman who had spent 5 years in close proximity to this man's patterns, that the morning after his return to comfort would have been identical to every other morning. The performance sustained until the next bright thing entered the room. What the borrowed work consumed until the next question arrived under the door. The same love, offered at the same distance, for the same approximate forever. She placed her hand flat on the blood seal scrolls. She said, "You can have the scrolls, Gorthon. You never needed the scrolls. You needed the mind that read them. And she is never coming back." She slid the scrolls across the table toward him. He picked them up. He opened one. He looked at the notation columns, immaculate, intricate, entirely beyond him. He sat with the authentic blood seal of the blood flare line in his hands, and he could not read a single character of it, and the knowledge of what that meant, of what it had always meant, of the entire structure of borrowed authority he had spent 5 years presenting as inheritance, settled into him completely and without escape. The negotiation terms were not punishing. Hiraethra had not designed them to be punishing. She had designed them to be accurate, to reflect, in plain legal language, the actual distribution of political authority that had always existed in the territories. The contested borderlands were formally ceded. The Bloodflare Pact's independent political authority over the 17 allied pacts was restructured under Silver Reach Alliance oversight, a formal arrangement in which the pact retained its name, its lands, its culture, its sovereignty in all domestic matters, and surrendered the political reach that had always, in every real sense, belonged to the mind that built the framework it ran on. Gorthon signed. His hand was steady. He had always been steady under pressure. It was one of the things she had admired most about him. Once, her Branthor Nightbreaker witnessed. His expression was the expression of a man who has known the shape of an ending for a long time, and has chosen to let it arrive because the alternative was worse. He looked at Hiraethra once, briefly, and there was something in his eyes that was neither apology nor resentment, but something closer to relief. The look of a wolf released from loyalty to a performance he had never fully believed in. Kael'thor Grimbreaker looked at Gorthon's signature on the page for a long moment. Then he looked at Hiraethra, and she saw in his face the specific expression of a man whose long-building suspicion has been confirmed so completely that confirmation itself is almost a comfort. Gorthon set down the pen. He looked at Hiraethra across the table, and in that look there was something less managed than everything that came before. Something that might, in a different circumstance, in a different man, have been the first honest moment of a genuine accounting. He said, "Was any of it real? Any of it?" He did not mean the pack. He did not mean the accords or the politics or the treaty they had just signed. He meant the library during the storm. He meant the cloak on her shoulders. He meant the 5 years in which she had given everything she had to a love she believed was being held carefully, and he had spent it the way comfortable men spend things, without counting, without looking, without ever asking what the balance might be. Hiraethra closed her document case. She stood. She said, "The bond was real. The work was real. What every night I gave you. Every morning I put the answers under your door before you woke up. Every treaty, every accord, every dispatch I decoded so you could walk into a room and be the man they expected. All of it was entirely real, a beat, just one. What you do with that understanding belongs to you now." She picked up her case. She walked out of the tent. The meadow outside was clean and cold, the sky a pale, still blue, with the last of the season's light coming in, flat across the silver birch ridge. She walked across the grass toward the Silver Reach encampment, at the steady pace of a woman who has somewhere to be, and knows the way. The cold air moved against her face. The silver of her dress caught the low afternoon light and held it. She did not look back. Not because it was not difficult, but it was difficult in the way that the last page of a long book is difficult, the difficulty of something finished, not failed. She had loved him. Genuinely and totally and without performance, she had loved the man in the library, the one with his cloak and his honest eyes and 4 words spoken without armor. That love had been real. She had already grieved its ending, thoroughly and alone, by candlelight, in the hidden chamber of the keep she had built, so he could stand in front of it and accept the praise. She had nothing left to grieve. She had already moved. The Blood Flare Pack did not collapse. Titles outlast the authority beneath them, and Gorthon kept his name and his keep and his medals and his place at the head of the great obsidian table. He attended the council meetings that still extended invitations, which grew fewer as the seasons turned. He gave no more speeches about strategy. No one asked him to. The grandfather drums of Darkbreaker Keep still beat on feast nights into halls that were quieter than before and considerably more honest. The hidden chamber in the East Wing's lower stone was found, finally, by a keep maintenance worker 6 weeks after Hyrithra's departure. The door was unlocked. The room inside was clean and empty, desk bare, candle stubs replaced with fresh ones, the east-facing window latched. The only thing that remained was the faint smell of wolfsbane candles and old parchment. No one knew what to make of it. It appeared on no building record. It held no designation. It was simply a room that had existed and been used and been vacated so completely that its vacancy was its own quiet declaration. Elinthra Frostflare left Darkbreaker Keep on a clear morning in early winter, carrying a modest travelling case and a reference letter signed by Branthor Nightbreaker, which identified her as a household professional of exceptional skill and character. The letter had not been requested. He had written it himself and left it at her door. She walked out through the front gate in the morning light, down the road north, and did not look back either. She arrived at the Silver Reach 6 days later. The door she was shown to was in the east wing of the Reach Hall. She knocked. A voice she recognized told her it was open. Hyrithra looked up from her desk. She looked at Elinthra in the doorway, at the travelling case, the winter-cold colour in her cheeks, the composure that had never once wavered in all the years Hyrithra had known her, and something moved across Hyrithra's face that she did not attempt to manage. She stood up. "I told you I would send for you," she said. Elinthra set her case down. "You took too long, that was all. It was enough." And in the east wing of the Reach Hall, a lamp burned late most evenings. The desk was covered in parchment, surveys and bond notations and territorial analyses and correspondence from the 17 allied packs, all of which now moved through the Silver Reach Alliance and carried the Blood Seal Arbiter's formal review. The lamp burned steady and patient and bright. The work was the same work it had always been, the careful, precise, necessary building of systems that held things together and kept them from coming apart at the edges. The difference was what it meant now, what it was called, whose name appeared on every page. Hyrithra Moonflare, Blood Seal Arbiter, and Intelligence Council of the Silver Reach Alliance worked with the same absorbed precision she had always possessed. On the desk beside the documents, a fresh pot of tea, still warm, a pair of reading lenses with silver rims, replaced last month when the old ones finally gave out. The travelling case, folded at the bottom of the wardrobe with its green dresses still inside, kept, not because she missed them, but because she did not believe in erasing things that were real. One evening, she sat back from the desk and looked out the window at the silver birch ridge, the trees bare now in deep winter, but still beautiful, pale and deliberate against the dark sky. She sat quietly for a moment. Then she picked up her tea while it was still warm, and she drank it. And she smiled. It was a small smile, private, entirely her own, the kind of smile that belongs to a woman who has finished building something difficult and stood back and looked at it and understood that it is exactly what she meant to build. The lamp burned on. The work continued. The name on every document was hers. And the Alpha King of the Blood Flare Pack sat in his grand hall in the evenings, in a chair that had somehow grown larger since the autumn, and outside his east wing a room existed that appeared on no record and held no designation. A room that had been a mind, once, and a love, and a 5-year architecture of invisible work that the whole pack had stood on without knowing it. He thought about it sometimes. He thought about the library, the storm, 4 words he had meant completely, and then, slowly, chosen not to live up to. Some things, once spent, cannot be restored by understanding them. He was learning that. It was a slow, thorough education, and the drums of Darkbreaker Keep kept playing into the dark, and the fire in the hearth kept burning, and the quiet that remained, the specific quiet of a room that used to have someone working in it, kept its patience with him, and waited, the way all honest things wait, to be fully reckoned with. Thank you for being here. If this story reached something in you, something about being overlooked, about quiet love, about building things in the dark for people who never thought to ask how they appeared, then this one was for you. Drop your name in the comments and tell me where you are watching from. I read every single one. Subscribe if you have not already. The quiet ones always win here. I will see you in the next story.